At 86, Chuck Norris has built more than a legendary career, he has built a fortune worth millions. But behind the tough guy image and decades of success is a deeply personal story about family sacrifice and what happens when a lifetime of work is finally passed on. His wealth may look like a dream from the outside, yet the reason his family struggles to face what comes next is far more emotional than anyone expected. Before Chuck Norris became the fearless walker Texas Ranger millions would recognize, he was a shy young boy growing up in circumstances that were far from glamorous. His childhood was shaped by financial hardship, family struggles, and the absence of the stable life many children take for granted. The man who would later become famous for playing strong, confident characters first had to overcome a very different battle, learning to believe in himself. Chuck Norris was born on March 10, 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma. His early years were not surrounded by Hollywood lights or celebrity dreams. His family moved during his childhood, and his mother, Wilma, played a major role in raising him and his two younger brothers. His father struggled with alcoholism and eventually left the family. That meant his mother had to carry much of the responsibility for the children. Money was tight, and Chuck later described himself as a quiet and shy child. That detail matters because the public image of Chuck Norris could not have been more different. People would eventually see him as the man who could walk into any room without fear. But the young Chuck was not that person yet. He was insecure. He was quiet, and he did not naturally feel like someone who could command attention. Sometimes, the people who appear strongest later in life are the ones who spent years trying to overcome feelings of weakness. For Chuck, one of the biggest changes came when he joined the United States Air Force after graduating high school. He served as an air policeman and was stationed in South Korea. It was there that something happened that would change the direction of his entire life. He discovered martial arts. Norris began studying Tang Soo Do, and the discipline gave him something he had not always possessed as a child: confidence. Training was not simply about learning how to fight. It demanded patience, repetition, control, and discipline. For a young man who had once been painfully shy, that transformation was enormous. He began to understand that strength was not something you were simply born with. It could be built. One training session became another. One achievement led to another. Eventually, martial arts became more than an interest. It became the foundation of his future. And this is where Chuck Norris's story becomes especially interesting. Because if he had never joined the Air Force, if he had never been stationed in Korea, and if he had never walked into a martial arts school, the world might never have known the man who would later become an action film icon. But there was still a long road ahead. After leaving the military, Norris continued developing his martial arts skills. He opened schools and became increasingly respected as a martial artist. His success in competition helped establish his reputation, but he still had another dream to chase: acting. At first, Hollywood did not exactly welcome him with open arms. The future star had to build his career slowly, learning how to turn physical ability into screen presence. His early opportunities were limited, and he had to prove that he was more than someone who could simply perform impressive martial arts moves. For anyone looking at Chuck Norris today, it is easy to forget how uncertain those early years really were. There was no guarantee that he would become a major movie star. There was no guarantee that television would make him famous. And there was certainly no guarantee that his name would eventually become one of the most recognizable in action entertainment. But one thing had already changed. The shy boy who once struggled with confidence had discovered discipline. And discipline would become one of the most important forces in his life. What do you think changes a person's future more, natural talent or the ability to keep going when life becomes difficult? Share your thoughts below. Chuck Norris was still far from becoming Walker, Texas Ranger. In fact, his biggest breakthrough had not even happened yet, but the foundation was already being built. And soon, the martial artist who had spent years proving himself would receive an opportunity that could change everything. The next chapter would take him from martial arts competition into Hollywood and introduce him to a world where one mistake could end a promising career before it truly began. But what happened next changed everything. Chuck Norris had already discovered martial arts, discipline, and confidence. Now he was about to discover something much harder: how to turn those skills into a career in entertainment. Hollywood was not waiting for him. He had to create his own opportunity, survive rejection, and prove that an action hero could be more than just a man who knew how to fight. By the late 1960s, Norris had become a serious martial arts competitor. He opened martial arts studios and developed a reputation for discipline and skill. His competition career gave him credibility, but it also introduced him to people who could influence the next stage of his life. One of those people was Bruce Lee. Norris and Lee became friends through the martial arts world. Their connection would become one of the most important relationships in Norris's early entertainment career. Lee understood that Norris had something unusual: the physical ability to perform on camera combined with the discipline to take training seriously. Then came an opportunity that most martial artists could only dream about. Norris appeared opposite Bruce Lee in Way of the Dragon, released in 1972. His role was small compared with what would come later, but the fight scene between Norris and Lee became one of the most memorable martial arts moments of the era. For Norris, however, the real importance was not simply appearing on screen. It was proof that he could belong there. The camera was no longer something happening around him. It was becoming part of his future. But success did not arrive overnight. Norris continued taking acting roles and learning the business. He appeared in films such as Good Guys Wear Black and A Force of One, gradually becoming more recognizable to audiences. Then came another major turning point. In 1983, Norris starred in Lone Wolf McQuade. The film helped strengthen his image as a tough, disciplined action star. More opportunities followed, including Missing in Action and Code of Silence. His career was gaining momentum, but there was a problem. Hollywood had many action stars. If Norris wanted to survive, he needed something that separated him from everyone else. He needed a character audiences could return to, and eventually, television provided exactly that opportunity. In 1993, Walker, Texas Ranger premiered. Norris played Cordell Walker, a Texas Ranger who believed in justice, discipline, and doing what was right. The character fit Norris almost perfectly. His martial arts background gave Walker physical credibility, while the show's moral themes gave him a broader audience. Suddenly, Norris was no longer simply a martial arts movie star. He had become a television icon. The series ran for 8 seasons and became closely associated with his name. For millions of viewers, Chuck Norris was no longer just an actor. He was Walker, and that distinction would eventually become extremely important to his financial future. Because the biggest part of Norris's fortune was not created from one movie. It was built over decades. Acting was only one piece of the puzzle. His martial arts career, books, endorsements, fitness businesses, television work, and other ventures all contributed to his public image and financial success. But there was another side to his growing fame. The more recognizable Norris became, the more people began to expect the larger-than-life character they saw on television to exist in real life. That image eventually became so powerful that the internet created an entire culture around Chuck Norris facts, jokes portraying him as almost superhuman. Norris himself became part of the joke, embracing the phenomenon rather than fighting it. But behind the humor was something real. His name had become a brand, and a brand can be more valuable than a single acting role. That was one of the lessons Norris's career demonstrated again and again. Fame can open doors, but longevity comes from knowing how to turn fame into something that lasts. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind famous names, subscribe, because the next part of Chuck Norris's story reveals how his career became much bigger than Hollywood, and how his greatest financial opportunities came from places many viewers never saw coming. By this point, the shy boy from Oklahoma had traveled an extraordinary distance. He had gone from military service to martial arts, from martial arts to Hollywood, and from Hollywood to one of television's most recognizable characters. But the rise came with a price. Fame changes a person's life. It changes how strangers see you. It changes what people expect from you. And sometimes, it changes the relationship between the public version of a person and the private person living behind it. For Norris, the biggest challenge was still ahead, because while audiences were celebrating Walker's strength, Chuck Norris was building a very different kind of legacy away from the television screen. And that legacy would eventually become deeply connected to his family, his businesses, and the fortune he spent decades creating. But becoming famous was only the beginning. Chuck Norris had already survived poverty, built himself through martial arts, and fought his way into Hollywood. Now, he was entering the period that would make his name almost impossible to forget. The strange part was that his greatest success did not come from becoming the biggest action star in Hollywood. It came from becoming a familiar face in millions of homes every week. After years of building his film career, Norris reached another level when Walker, Texas Ranger premiered in 1993. The series was built around Cordell Walker, a Texas Ranger who followed his own strong code of justice. He was tough, calm, disciplined, and deeply loyal to the people around him. For Norris, the role was almost perfectly suited to the image he had developed throughout his life. But there was something different about television. A movie might be watched once. A television character could become part of a family's routine. Every week, viewers could return to Walker, and that repeated exposure transformed Norris from an action actor into a household name. The show became one of the defining projects of his career. It ran for 8 seasons, ending its original run in 2001. During those years, Norris's public identity became almost inseparable from Walker. Children knew him, parents knew him, older audiences knew him, and eventually, even people who had never watched the show knew his name. That level of recognition created something far more valuable than a successful television role. It created trust in the name Chuck Norris. And Norris understood how powerful that could be. He did not limit himself to acting. He continued working in martial arts, writing books, promoting fitness, appearing in advertisements, and participating in business ventures. His career increasingly became an example of how a celebrity can turn personal reputation into a wider brand. One major part of that image was fitness. Norris had spent decades training his body and practicing martial arts. He understood that audiences did not simply admire his ability to perform action scenes. They also admired his discipline and physical condition that made fitness a natural extension of his celebrity. He became associated with exercise products and fitness programs, including the Total Gym, which he promoted alongside Christy Brinkley in widely seen television advertisements. The commercials introduced Norris to another generation of viewers. For some people, he was Walker. For others, he was the martial arts expert. And for many, he was the older action star appearing on television and encouraging people to stay active. This ability to remain visible helped Norris maintain his relevance long after his biggest theatrical successes. But fame can also take an unexpected turn. During the 2000s, the internet created the famous Chuck Norris facts phenomenon. Suddenly, jokes about Norris portrayed him as almost impossibly powerful. The jokes were absurd. People claimed he could do things no human could possibly do. Yet, instead of becoming angry about the jokes, Norris largely embraced the phenomenon. That decision was important. He understood that the internet was giving his name a new life. A career that had been built through movies and television was now becoming part of internet culture. And that meant Chuck Norris was no longer simply an actor. He had become a recognizable piece of popular culture. But behind the jokes and action scenes was a man whose life had become increasingly connected to family and faith. Norris had married multiple times and became a father to several children. His family life existed alongside a career that often demanded long hours, travel, and public attention. And eventually, those two worlds would collide. Because the more successful Norris became, the more important the question of legacy became. What would happen to everything he had built? The fame, the businesses, the money, the name, the properties. And most importantly, the family who would remain after the camera stopped rolling. That question becomes even more interesting when we remember where Norris started. He was not born into Hollywood wealth. He did not inherit an entertainment empire. His success developed over decades of work. And while exact estimates of celebrity wealth can vary widely, publicly reported figures have placed Norris's net worth in the tens of millions of dollars. But a fortune is not simply a number. For a person who started with very little, wealth can represent something much deeper. It can represent security. It can represent freedom. And sometimes, it can represent the desire to make sure your family never experiences the same struggles you once did. That may be one reason the story of Norris's fortune is more emotional than it first appears. Because the real question is not simply how much money he made. The real question is what that money means to the people closest to him. And that brings us to the darker side of success. Because fame does not remove pressure. Money does not eliminate fear. And even a man famous for playing one of television's toughest characters can face moments that no amount of strength can completely control. By the time Norris entered the later stages of his career, his priorities were changing. Family mattered more. Health and personal life mattered more. And the enormous entertainment machine that had surrounded him for decades was slowly becoming less important. But the public still saw the legend. They saw Walker. They saw the action hero. They saw the jokes. They saw the fortune. What they did not always see was the human being behind all of it. And that hidden side of his life would become one of the most important parts of his legacy. But behind the tough image was a man whose priorities were changing. For decades, Chuck Norris had built his life around work, discipline, and responsibility. Yet, as the years passed, the cameras became less important, while family became more important than ever. And the greatest challenge was no longer proving that he could become successful. It was learning what success could never protect him from. The public often sees celebrities through a simple lens. They see the movies. They see the television shows. They see the awards, money, houses, and famous friends. But they rarely see the decisions that happen away from the cameras. For Norris, one of those decisions involved his family. After Walker, Texas Ranger, ended its original run in 2001, he continued acting, but his career became less focused on constant production. He appeared in films and television projects, but the pace was different. Then came a deeply personal chapter. In 2017, Norris stepped away from the production of the television series The Expendables 2 because his wife, Gina, experienced serious health problems. That decision revealed something important about the man behind the action hero image. For Norris, family could come before a paycheck. He had spent decades building a career where being tough was part of his identity. But real strength sometimes means knowing when to walk away. His wife later spoke publicly about her health problems, which she associated with exposure to gadolinium during MRI procedures. Norris became an outspoken supporter of her and of efforts to raise awareness about the issue. Whatever one thinks about the medical claims surrounding gadolinium, the personal impact on the Norris family was clear. They were dealing with a frightening situation that had nothing to do with Hollywood. And this was a very different kind of battle. There was no movie script, no stunt double, no director shouting cut. It was simply a husband trying to stand beside his wife. That period also showed why celebrity wealth can never be measured only in dollars. Money can provide options. It can provide access. It can provide security. But it cannot guarantee that the people you love will never suffer. And perhaps that is one of the hardest lessons hidden behind Norris's fortune. For years, the public had watched him play characters who solved problems with courage and physical strength. Real life does not work that way. Sometimes there is no dramatic final fight. Sometimes there is only patience. Sometimes there is waiting. And sometimes there is simply being there for someone. As Norris grew older, his relationship with fame also changed. The man who had once been constantly associated with action movies and television became increasingly focused on his family, faith, charitable work, and personal life. His public appearances became more selective, his priorities became clearer, and the image of the unstoppable action hero slowly began to make room for something more human. A husband, a father, a grandfather, a man looking back on decades of decisions. This is also where the subject of money becomes more complicated. Celebrity websites often publish exact-looking net worth numbers, but those figures should be treated carefully. Unless a celebrity publicly releases complete financial records, outside estimates can differ considerably. So, when people hear claims about Chuck Norris's fortune, the more useful question is not simply, how many millions does he have? It is, how did he build a financial life that could outlast his acting career? The answer appears to involve many years of work across different areas. Acting provided major income. Martial arts built his reputation. Fitness endorsements expanded his reach. Books added another source of income and influence. Business ventures turned his name into something larger than a movie credit. And his long career gave him something that many celebrities never achieve: longevity. He did not become famous for 1 year and disappear. His name remained recognizable across multiple generations. But there was another cost to that longevity. The public never really stopped watching. Even after his biggest television years, people continued to discuss his career, his family, his health, and his fortune. That can create a strange situation for someone who simply wants to live a quieter life. The more famous you become, the less private ordinary life can feel. And eventually, every celebrity faces the same unavoidable question. What happens when the career ends completely? For Norris, that question carries special weight because of how long his career lasted. He began building his reputation decades ago. He became a movie star, then a television star, then an internet legend, then a businessman and author. And now, his most important role may simply be being part of his family. That is why the story of his fortune cannot be separated from the story of his relationships. A fortune is not meaningful because it looks impressive on paper. It becomes meaningful because of what someone chooses to do with it. And Norris has spent years showing that his interests extend beyond entertainment. His Christian faith has also played a major role in his public life. He has written about faith and values and has supported charitable causes. For someone who grew up experiencing financial hardship, that shift is significant. The young Chuck Norris wanted to become stronger. The older Chuck Norris appeared increasingly interested in using his success for something bigger than himself. But there was still one major part of the story left, because while Norris was stepping away from the center of Hollywood, the fortune connected to his name did not simply disappear. His businesses, investments, intellectual property, and long-established brand continued to carry value. And that raises the question at the heart of this entire story. What happens to all of it when the man who built it is no longer here to control it? That is where the story becomes less about Chuck Norris the celebrity and much more about Chuck Norris the father, husband, and legacy builder. And the answer may explain why the future of his fortune is so emotional for the people closest to him. The biggest surprise about Chuck Norris's fortune is that it was never built from acting alone. By the time he became a household name, he had already spent decades creating a reputation that could work beyond the screen. Martial arts, television, fitness, books, endorsements, and business opportunities all became pieces of a much larger financial story. And after his death on March 19, 2026, that story changed forever. Chuck Norris understood something that many entertainers learned too late. Fame can disappear. A television show can end. A movie career can slow down. But a strong personal brand can continue working long after the cameras stop. That was especially true for Norris. His name became connected to strength, discipline, fitness, martial arts, and the character he played for 8 seasons on Walker, Texas Ranger. The show became a major success, and Paramount noted that it reached an average audience of 19.4 million viewers at its peak season. That kind of exposure had enormous value, but Norris did not simply depend on television checks. He built businesses and partnerships around the things people already associated with him. Fitness was one of the clearest examples. For decades, Norris had promoted physical training as a way of life. His martial arts background made that message believable. His image could be connected to exercise products and fitness programs in a way that felt natural to his audience. One of the most recognizable examples was the Total Gym. Norris became closely associated with the fitness brand through advertising, helping introduce the equipment to millions of viewers. The strategy was simple but powerful. Instead of asking people to buy something because a famous actor appeared in an advertisement, the brand connected the product with the qualities Norris represented: strength, discipline, age-defying fitness, consistency. Those qualities had become part of his identity. And that is where the real power of celebrity branding appears. The product is not only the product. The celebrity's reputation becomes part of what people are buying. Norris also wrote books, including works about his life, martial arts, fitness, and personal beliefs. His writing gave him another way to communicate directly with audiences without needing a movie studio or television network. Then there was the value of his name itself. For decades, Chuck Norris had been more than the name of an actor. It became a cultural symbol. The internet's famous Chuck Norris jokes made that even more obvious. The jokes were exaggerated and fictional, but they kept his name circulating among people who were sometimes too young to remember his biggest movies. That kind of cultural recognition is difficult to create, and once created, it can become an asset. But there is an important warning here. Celebrity net worth figures should not be treated as exact financial statements. Various websites have published estimates of Norris's wealth, often placing it in the tens of millions of dollars. However, private assets, property values, business interests, taxes, expenses, and estate arrangements are not fully available to the public. So, rather than pretending there is one confirmed number, it is safer to say that Norris accumulated substantial wealth across a career that lasted for decades. And now comes the question that makes this story emotional. Who receives the value of everything he built? Chuck Norris was survived by his wife, Gina O'Kelly, and 5 children. His family includes sons Mike and Eric from his first marriage, twins Dakota and Danielle with Gina, and daughter Dina, whom Norris publicly acknowledged later in life. For those children, their father's legacy is not simply a bank balance. It is a name they grew up carrying. It is a career they watched from close range. It is the stories, photographs, businesses, books, properties, and memories left behind by a man whose public image became larger than life. And that is where the title of this documentary takes on a different meaning. A fortune can look impressive from the outside, but for a family that has just lost someone they love, money can feel almost meaningless compared with the person who earned it. The value of an estate can be calculated. The value of a father cannot. That distinction is especially powerful in Norris's case because his entire public identity was built around strength. For decades, audiences watched him defeat villains. He appeared almost impossible to break. But death is the one opponent no action hero can defeat. And when Norris died at 86, his family confirmed that he had been surrounded by family and was at peace. His official cause of death was not publicly disclosed. That final image is very different from the one millions of people remember. Not Walker entering a fight, not the martial artist facing an opponent, not the action hero standing alone, just a husband and father surrounded by the people closest to him. Everyone eventually leaves something behind. It might be money, a career, a home, or simply memories. What do you think matters most when a person is gone? For Norris, the answer may be found in the people who knew him away from the spotlight. His fortune may eventually be divided. His businesses may change hands. His properties may be sold. His old shows may continue playing. But the stories his children tell about their father are something no financial document can measure. And there is one final question still waiting. After decades of building a career, surviving hardship, becoming a global star, and creating wealth beyond Hollywood, what will Chuck Norris ultimately be remembered for? The answer may have very little to do with money, and everything to do with the legacy he leaves inside his own family. But perhaps the most powerful part of Chuck Norris's story is not the fortune he leaves behind. It is the difference between the man the world thought it knew and the man his family knew at home. On March 19, 2026, Chuck Norris died at the age of 86. His family announced his passing the following day, saying that he had been surrounded by family and was at peace. They also asked the public to respect their privacy and did not disclose the circumstances of his death. That final detail is important because for decades, Chuck Norris had been almost impossible to separate from the idea of strength. He was the fighter, the protector, the man who never seemed afraid. His image became so powerful that the internet eventually turned him into a joke. People created unbelievable stories about what Chuck Norris could supposedly do. The jokes were fictional, but they revealed something real. His name had become larger than his career. Yet, his family's statement painted a very different picture. They did not describe him as a superhero. They described him as a devoted husband, a loving father and grandfather, an incredible brother, and the heart of their family. That may be the most important part of his legacy, because when the cameras disappear, the character disappears with them. What remains is family. The people who knew the private man, the people who saw the difficult days, the people who celebrated the victories, and the people who will now have to live with his absence. For fans, Chuck Norris's legacy will always include Walker, Texas Ranger. It will include his action movies. It will include martial arts. It will include Bruce Lee. It will include the famous internet jokes. It will include the image of a man who seemed almost impossible to defeat. But for his family, his legacy is likely much simpler. It is the memories of a husband and father. It is the lessons he taught. It is the time they spent together. And it is the knowledge that beneath the famous name was a human being who loved the people closest to him. That is why the fortune he leaves behind is only one part of the story. A financial estate can be divided. A business can be sold. A house can change owners. A television series can continue playing decades after its star is gone. But memories cannot be divided so easily. And that may explain why the idea of his family crying over his fortune is misleading if taken literally. There is no verified public evidence showing that his family is crying specifically because of the size of his fortune. What is clear is that they are grieving his death. The fortune is simply part of what he leaves behind. And that distinction matters, because sensational headlines can make a story sound like it is about money when the deeper story is actually about loss. Chuck Norris spent more than half a century building a name that millions recognized. But in the end, the value of his life cannot be calculated by a net worth estimate. It cannot be measured by box office numbers. It cannot be measured by television ratings. And it certainly cannot be measured by internet jokes. His real legacy is the number of lives he influenced. He inspired people to train. He inspired people to pursue discipline. He showed that a quiet, insecure young man could completely transform himself. He proved that a person could build a second career after military service. He moved from martial arts into movies, from movies into television, from television into business, and from celebrity into something even more difficult to achieve. Lasting cultural recognition. That is why Chuck Norris remained relevant for so many decades. He did not simply play strong characters. He built his life around discipline, and perhaps that is the biggest lesson his story leaves behind. Success does not happen in one dramatic moment. It is usually built through hundreds of ordinary decisions. Showing up, training again, trying again, accepting rejection, learning something new, taking care of the people you love, and continuing long after other people think your best days are over. Chuck Norris's journey began with a shy boy from Oklahoma who did not know what his future would look like. That boy could never have imagined becoming an international martial arts champion. He could never have imagined standing opposite Bruce Lee. He could never have imagined becoming one of television's most recognizable action stars. and he certainly could not have imagined that decades later, people around the world would still know his name. But that is what happened. And now the career has ended. The television episodes remain. The movies remain. The books remain. The memories remain. And the fortune remains with the family he spent decades building a life around. Everyone leaves something behind. Some leave money. Some leave memories. Some leave lessons. The rare few leave all three. Chuck Norris appears to belong to that final group. His money may eventually be divided among heirs. His businesses may change. His properties may change hands. But his name will continue to exist in popular culture. Every time someone watches Walker, Texas Ranger, his image returns. Every time someone watches one of his classic action films, the legend returns. And every time someone tells a ridiculous Chuck Norris joke, another small piece of that cultural legacy survives. But perhaps his family will remember something the rest of the world never fully understood. The toughest man on television was never just Walker. He was Chuck, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a martial artist, an actor, a businessman, and a man who spent his life trying to become stronger, not only for himself, but for the people he loved. So, when we talk about the fortune Chuck Norris leaves behind, we should remember what that fortune really represents. It represents decades of work, decades of discipline, decades of sacrifice, and a lifetime spent turning a difficult beginning into an extraordinary journey. The money may tell us how successful he became, but his family tells us who he was. And perhaps that is the legacy that matters most. This is the story that remains after the legend is gone.